question is, I guess, it kind of covers both of you. So I'm interested to know what both of you what you think. It's really a question about. I never get this word right. Subsidiarism, or is that the right way to pronounce it? So the idea that you should devolve responsibility to the smallest group possible, which is really interesting. And I imagine co-ops are kind of well, I don't even know whether co-ops are kind of an example of that or not. So I'm curious to know what the connection is between subsidiarism as a kind of social model and co-ops. But also, more importantly, I think you described a lot of flowering opportunities or demonstrations of a kind of new models that are coming up. And it seems to me that to make these things scale and become normal, you need a policy that would kind of support that devolution of responsibility. I'm just curious to know what you see as being what's required to support these things from a policy perspective, or just to encourage them.
Great, thank you. Yes, principle of subsidiarity, which runs through in various different ways in various different philosophies. Elinor Ostrom, the Nobel Prize-winning economist who wrote a lot on commons, calls it polycentricity. Similar kind of idea that that decisions tend to be made best by smallish groups of people who are reasonably close to that point of decision, to the point of reference for the decision. That obviously works really well for smallish local issues. Less well for massive global issues. But many massive global issues can, of course, be broken up into smaller parts and be able to be bitten off and chewed. So climate change, you can try to deal with it through a massive global convention, or you can try to deal with it by empowering local communities to set up renewable energy cooperatives and walking school buses and grow their own food in the streets and all sorts of things like that. And the two can and should go hand in hand. The idea of subsidiarity and polycentricity is that what you can do as a society is work out what can be dealt with and should be dealt with by the local community, guided and supported institutionally by larger governments above them. And you know, there's models such as Bookchin's eco-municipalism, where he talks about representatives going from each of those grassroots groups up to others, and all sorts of different ways of doing it. But essentially, it's about working out together what should be dealt with at a high level and what can be dealt with at a grassroots level. And that can differ in all sorts of places. In terms of the institutional support, which goes alongside it, I think it needs to be a whole bunch of different things. To me, universal basic income is a sine qua non. It's got to be part of it. Because one of the key reasons we don't have much participation at the moment is because most of us don't feel we have the time to commit. That's a huge problem for a whole lot of environmental and social change organisations. We can't find many volunteers other than undergraduate students and retirees, who are great, but most people don't feel they have the time to participate. So I think that's central to it. There's a whole lot more of institutional things we can do, like, as I say, kind of tax breaks for co-ops and all sorts of things like that. But
yeah, I'll just be brief. Look, if you want to start, you have to overcome the fatalism that nothing can be done. That's the first issue. I won't say more than that.
I'm a great fan of Bernie Sanders, and I think to this day that had he been the candidate instead of Hillary Clinton, we probably would have won. In fact, I'm pretty sure. Now, he is a social democrat, but he doesn't have the drawback of being one for centralised power. So I don't know whether you would share with me that he would be a good example of what you're after. Add to that, my other question is, how do we go about getting the commons for people? who would be doing the right thing.
On Sanders, absolutely. I also agree with you. I think if he had been the candidate, he would have won, and I think we would be much, much, much better off, without a shadow of a doubt. And yes, don't take my criticism kind of too. I couch it, in caveats. I do think that a lot of what Sanders talks about is very much in line with the kinds of things I'm talking about. There's my big criticism, I guess, of his philosophy still, both Sanders and Corbyn see the environment as an add-on. And almost explicitly so. I've read interviews and seen interviews with both of them where they basically tack it on afterwards as an afterthought. And that's the really big dispute I have with both of them, is that you cannot conceive of the common good for people without putting protecting nature at the heart. So that's my big dispute with him. Yes, he's a much less centralising social democrat than most. Corbyn is not. Corbyn is very, very much. But yes, I know. So there's a differentiation there. But I think you're right about Sanders. He doesn't fall into the same centralising trap.
Look, I love Bernie, but beware the enormous conservatism, the Make America Great beliefs that will hinder all his aspirations at every turn. You only have to see the rejection by the gun lobby and by the politicians of the appeals from these students this week to know what the enormous self-conviction, the enormous commitment to capitalism. I mean, there are two appalling lobbies in America. One's the Rifle Association, the gun lobby, and the other one is AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. There isn't a politician, again, in terms of one of the worst atrocities in the world, one of the longest and most brutal occupation that the world's known since the Second World War. There isn't one American politician who dares, and even Bernie, to go against the power of that lobby. And we've got it. You can see it here in Australia as well. So by all means, let's have the charismatic, visionary, encouraging leader, but beware the entrenched conservatism of the public institutions and the private institutions in the United States.
One of the problems that I see here, and I've seen this many times in these meetings, is that the word doesn't get out. Now, here's an example of it. This morning on radio, you heard that lovely chairman of Qantas talking about backing the $60 billion tax break. Now, anyone in grade 12 economics or whatever grade it is would know that that's a load of crap, pardon my language, all right? Why is it that it's so hard to get your type of views out there, yet the other people get their views out there and they brainwash us? All right? What are you going to do about that to make sure that this stuff gets out there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we've done well tonight with this audience. I mean, we have to have different conversations. I mean, that video is not unimportant. I mean, look, I'm a believer in small victories. We're not going to suddenly own a newspaper which everybody reads. I'm too cautious to know whether social media is really making a dent. I see the advance of narcissism through it, and I hear and read a lot about bullying by media means. I'm not sure yet whether that's going to give us time to read a book like this, reread Tim's lectures, go away and scratch your heads and talk with enthusiasm to other people about it. I mean, I'm a face-to-face person, Joe.
I'm a big believer in face-to-face myself. I think one of the interesting things that's happening, and we're yet to see whether it's going to be wholeheartedly a good thing or not, is the collapse in people's trust in right-wing press, Murdoch papers in particular. I think there's definitely a very great thing to celebrate there, that in the last few years, they've run very concerted election campaigns and lost. And that's not happened in a generation. So that's undeniably a good thing. The caveat behind it is that comes with a collapse of trust in media generally and a collapse in markets in media generally, which is problematic because along with it goes the collapse in public interest media. So yes, there are problems. I think technology gives us the capacity to communicate in all sorts of new and more democratic ways. It also obviously gives us the capacity to be more narcissistic. So there are challenges. But I think there are green shoots as well. Certainly in Canberra, there's been an explosion of a flowering of local groups coming together to have dinner parties to discuss ideas and little transition town initiatives and transition streets and people seeking that contact with each other to talk to each other about ideas. And I really am a great believer in that as a mechanism. But I think that top-down control of the right-wing hegemony that has been in place for so long is collapsing. The danger is what's going to replace it. Are we going to win or are the fascists going to win?
Tim mentioned how the right wing have seized disaffection to form, popular movements and to grow in strength. Are there any Green politicians or other left-wing politicians that you think have any examples of them presenting this kind of vision well, with messaging and imagery and communicating to people, really getting through to people? And the second part of it, how could they be doing that better?
Well, I mean, I think somebody like Senator Lee Rhiannon, who gets stigmatized because she's called a socialist. Socialism originally conceived was about fellowship. That's what it was about. It's about I think we need to find another language there's a kind of what the psychologists call a cognitive dissonance, that you can't get people to embrace something that would even be beneficial for them. I mean, that's the problem that's gone on. It was called deer hunting with Jesus in this problem. Okay, I'll try and explain. I got 30 seconds on that. On deer hunting with Jesus. These are the people who supported Trump. Deer hunting was about large numbers of people, not the people who that's all of us who are going to be invited to a dinner party in Canberra by Tim, apparently. The deer hunters were the people, the gun lobby, who liked to go out hunting and shoot anything. They were largely unemployed, underemployed, relatively poor, fundamentalist Christians. So that was the Jesus bit. They worship. America's got religiosity gone mad, not just which is associated with the gun culture. So that's a kind of moral damnation of anybody who's not like them. So I don't know how I got.
That's the opposite of what I'm talking.
Yeah,
about.
Yeah. It's the opposite. But we need to expose that. But the Lee Rhiannons are talking about the opposite of that, as far as I'm concerned.
Inspiring examples.
And I'm thinking Australia.
In Australia, yes. Okay, so I was going to say I think Sanders in many ways did a great job. I think Corbyn really kind of electrified in some senses, although not this specific vision. As I say, quite a different one. There've been models, as I mentioned. I think what they've done in Barcelona is tremendous. Very, very much through a grassroots building, though, rather than a charismatic leader and an imagining kind of a visioning kind of process, through a grassroots engagement strategy. And I guess I would say that's the issue here, is that the left tends to have a more sophisticated view of politics, if we can say that, which doesn't lend itself to kind of superficial, smoke and mirrors kind of rhetoric, as well as the right ultra simplification of the world into goodies and baddies does. It's much harder for us to do it.
Jesus had some pretty
Sure.
clear aphorisms.
Yeah, true. No, and there are ways of doing it. I mean, I guess I would say probably the person in Australia who I found most able to do it and most inspiring is Scott Ludlam, and I think he's an extraordinary loss to political life, and hopefully he'll come back. But there are a bunch of people who are getting really, really good at it in various ways. Outside the specific political sphere, I see the growth in the climate movement and interesting spaces in the climate movement in places like the SEED, Indigenous Youth Climate Mob, doing some brilliant campaigning and communication and visioning for the future, and the Stop Adani campaign. But again, it's very specific, so it's easier to do that. Whereas I think what SEED does is actually presents a positive vision for the future, as well as a stop these particular projects. Also, I think some of the really interesting imagining around welcoming refugees that's being done by some campaign groups as well does it well.
I just want to add a point about courage to respond. People have to have the courage to express the alternatives. And frankly, on some major issues, with a few exceptions like Lee Ryan and a few others, they're scared out of their wits to stick there, particularly on the Palestinian issue. They're scared out of their wits. The closer you get to Canberra, the more courage diminishes. So on all sorts of issues, I mean, you know, not in the groups where we support one another and are speaking the same language. So courage is a crucial issue.
One area which Tim mentioned, which particularly resonates with me, is the what you could call alternative economy sector. Being someone who engages with quite a few of these myself, such as Free Cycle and the Let's local energy trading system, and close to where I live in the inner west, we've got the wonderful Addison Road Community Centre with the Bauer Reuse Centre and the reverse garbage repurposing of all sorts of materials and so on. So a lot of these practices, surprisingly, among some people on the left, I find aren't taken up as much as you would think they would, in a sense, maybe because of other priorities and so on. But my question, maybe you could address that too, but you also mentioned how at the other end of the things, the political sort of institutions and so on, the parties through government policy and so on, how it could support that sort of economy to grow. And so you mentioned a couple of things like universal basic income and so on. So I was wondering if there's some other areas which you'd like to mention as well, how that could be furthered.
Very briefly, conscious of time, I think one of the most important is underwriting public liability insurance for a whole lot of these repair cafes and things like that. Critically important. Direct investment, frankly. Grant schemes, direct investment. And tax breaks in some ways. So the Swedish Greens, who are in coalition government in Sweden, recently implemented a tax break for repair rather than buying new. If you can demonstrate that you've repaired something rather than bought a new one, you get a tax break for that. So there's all sorts of really innovative, interesting ways that you can support those. But fundamentally, institutionally, I think it's the underwriting, the insurance, and the direct grants which is going to be the most useful.
I apologise first to Stuart, but I thought he would have known that Bourbon and Beefsteak is the institution of King's Cross, even though it had been sold out to eastern suburbs yuppies and was formerly run by Bernie Horton, a front for the CIA, money laundering and, you know, demolition job of...
What's the question?
I thought Stuart would have had at least one drink in the Bourbon and Beef after hours in the last 50 years, at least one. Anyway, the whole block's going to go from the Bourbon and Beef down to the Empire. Mirvac are going to put up another skyscraper, and there'll be another 10,000 Chinese millionaires coming in after exploiting the Chinese masses and paying them next to nothing. All right, Joe, I had to get my apology in, and I've got an apology for Cass as well for suggesting she got the sack from Queensland when she didn't. She resigned on her own accord. Now, is anyone else here? Am I owed an apology from me? Yes, everyone, including Joe. All right, I'm sorry to everyone, but I come in here on a
What's the
Thursday
question?
night
Just tell
after a
us the
12-hour
question.
shift. The question is, it seems to me, finally, the good guys have cut through all this bullshit about trickle down and lowering tax cuts will somehow lead to a raising of wages by pointing out Qantas's big raise. And you look at the letters to the editor in the Herald today over the NAB getting an extra profit up to 4.2 billion or something, and then saying that they're going to eliminate thousands
You're
of
going
jobs.
to use up all the time and there won't be an answer.
All right. Well, my question is, why can't the progressive forces in this room and outside of this room cut through the bullshit over privatisation of public transport that I've been screaming about for the last 12 months in my sheet, where Fairfield and Smithfield Depot are going to take over the inner west and be subsidised over 80% out of taxpayers' money and make a cool $5-10 million profit because they're a private company. Private enterprise is better. Why can't we get across the idea that transport, health, hospitals, education are a basic human need? You know, and it seems to me that the Green Institutes and all the other progressive institutes have. I know Lee Rhiann's done a book on the subject, but I see it's just not penetrating the media. That privatisation is somehow not good for you.
Okay, Jeff, thank you, you've answered your own question. Except that, I mean, the quick... Oh, I'm sorry, okay, no, but
This is the end. We have 2 minutes left for Tim to answer.
I won't take 2 minutes. I actually think it has. I think it is well and truly in the public consciousness, and in that old idea that privatisation is the way to go is dead. I think that it is widely and broadly held that belief. The problem is it hasn't penetrated those in government yet, either Liberals or Labor, but in some cases it has. I mean, Labor was tearing itself apart on electricity privatisation here in New South Wales. So I think the era of privatisation is very swiftly coming to a close. There are still a bunch of battles to be fought, and there's still a whole lot of work to bring a whole lot of these things back into public ownership and into common ownership and cooperative ownership a lot of the time as well. But well, we campaign, we work hard for a long time. But yeah, that I think my answer is that it's done, it's over.
Does the ongoing theft and enclosure and privatisation of the commons not necessitate the revival of the utopian ideal of communism as a restoration of the Commonwealth, open access to all, to society's wealth and responsible custodianship of nature's bounty for all? That's my question.
yeah, look, it's about the conversation, it's about the way we talk. I'm not going to be more complex than that. It's about what we talk about. It's about the content of conversations. It's about making the point that Liz Elliott makes so powerfully in this book, and she's a rather sophisticated doctor, a medical doctor as well, that it's good for your health. That business of sharing, that sense of interdependence, small or larger economies, is enormously beneficial for the common good, and better than aspirins.
Really briefly, the problem for me with the idea of communism is that the way it was implemented, the way it has been very much at odds with the idea of the common good, because it is fundamentally based on destroying interpersonal trust, which it runs fundamentally counter to the idea of the commons. The way communism was implemented destroyed interpersonal trust. It destroyed the fabric of society. So I don't believe... Yes, there's a whole lot of the theory and the substance which we can turn back to, a huge amount of it. But I actually go back further and further again to the indigenous wisdom and the ancient wisdom of the commons itself. So, conscious we've run out of time, but
I'll be very, very quick. I'll be very, very quick. But, you know, some of the discussion has given us a little bit of a pessimistic view. I think that there's a struggle going on for democracy in Australia, and I'm not sure because I didn't hear the start. One of the greatest victories we've had was the referendum for equal marriage rights. As far as I'm concerned, that was a massive victory for democracy in Australia. That should be recognised. But secondly, I just wanted to mention specifically the question on this question of privatisation. It's not been publicised widely, but the Nurses Union and the others have had a massive victory here in New South Wales. They have stopped the privatisation of all the regional hospitals. Do people know that? All around, it's a community-based campaign. It's a perfect example of community democracy. They have stopped the Shell Harbour Hospital, the Maitland Hospital, all these hospitals. To me, it's an absolutely perfect example of democracy in action.
Why do you keep covering up for the buses privatisation by sucking up the bum of the union?
I'm going to. I'm trying to. Leave aside this character here. I'm trying to say that there is a struggle going on, and we are having some wins, and we are having some wins, and I think when I say we, the people are having some wins, and it's, you know, we've got to keep going forward with that. Thank you.
Right. That's not a question, really, is it? No.
You're undermining the bus struggle.
Can
Jim.
someone turn that microphone off, please?
Okay, you go for it.
Okay, I just wanted to say, would you please thank our speakers, because I think they were both excellent. And also to say that next week it will be the usual length, and the topic is the toxic influence of the Zionist lobby, which I think was also touched on tonight. And please feel free to come up and buy the $5 books while we're closing down. Thank you. That's $10. That's a novel.